Mrs. Collins, you are legally responsible for $284,000 in outstanding loans. That was the sentence that ended the life I thought I understood, and the worst part wasn't the number, it was what came next, because when I asked the bank manager to repeat himself, slower this time, he did. And then he added something I wasn't prepared to hear, something that made my hands go cold right there on my kitchen table. The mailing address listed on all applications matches your daughter's residence in St. Louis. I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there with the phone pressed against my ear, staring at the same spot on the wall I'd been staring at for years, the place where I used to hang Emily's college acceptance letter. The one I kept framed because I thought it meant something, because I thought it proved I had done something right as a mother. I raised her on my own, worked 32 years at the public library, never missed a bill, never missed a payment, not once. I built a life out of discipline and quiet sacrifice, and now a stranger on the phone was telling me that life had been used as collateral for something I never agreed to, something I never signed, something I never even knew existed. I remember asking him one question, just one. Are you sure those loans are under my name? And there was a pause, a small one, but long enough for me to understand the answer before he said it. Yes, ma'am. Your name, your social security number, your credit history, everything. Matches. Everything matches. That's what he said, as if that explained anything, as if that made it make sense, as if I was supposed to accept that the identity I had protected for 72 years could be copied, used, and spent without me noticing. I thanked him politely, because that's what I've always done. I thanked him and hung up, and for a long time I didn't move. I just listened to the silence in my house, the kind of silence that feels different once you realize something has already gone wrong, something you can't undo. I should have panicked. I should have called Emily right then and demanded answers, but I didn't, because somewhere deep down I already knew. I knew before I saw a single document, before I stepped foot in that bank, before I heard another word. I knew exactly whose address that was and why it was there, and that's the part that broke me. Not the money, not the debt, but the realization that this wasn't a mistake, this wasn't fraud by a stranger, this was something much closer, something that had been happening quietly while I trusted the people I thought would never cross that line, and by the end of that week, one of us was going to have to face the law. I just didn't know yet which one of us it would be. I drove to the bank the next morning before I could change my mind, because once something like this enters your life, you either face it or it quietly takes everything from you, and I have never been the kind of woman who lets problems grow in the dark. Even when I am afraid of what I might find, the branch was smaller than I expected, just a single story building off a busy road in St. Louis County, the kind of place where people go to open savings accounts and apply for car loans, not the kind of place where a 72-year-old woman walks in to discover her name has been used for nearly $300,000 in debt. I remember the way the glass door felt heavier than usual when I pulled it open. Like I was stepping into something I could not step back out of. The receptionist smiled at me, polite, routine, the same kind of smile I have given thousands of people over the years, and I told her my name, Margaret Collins, and that I needed to speak with someone about a loan account. She typed something into her computer, her expression shifting just slightly, not alarmed but attentive, like she already knew this was not a normal request. Within minutes I was sitting across from a man in a gray suit, mid-40s, calm voice, careful eyes, the kind of person trained to stay neutral no matter what he hears. He introduced himself as Daniel Harris, branch manager, and asked how he could help me. I slid the printed statement across his desk, the one I had asked them to email me after the call, and I said, I need you to explain why my name is on these loans. He did not answer right away. He studied the document, then looked at me, not suspicious, not accusing, just measured. Mrs. Collins, these accounts were opened over the past 18 months. Multiple applications, all approved based on your credit profile. 18 months. I repeated that in my head. 18 months of something happening behind my back, while I went about my life believing everything was exactly as I left it. He turned his monitor slightly so I could see, and that was the moment everything became real. There it was, my name, my social security number, my credit history, all correct, all accurate, Nothing forged in a way that looked obvious, except for one thing. The signature. I leaned closer, studying it. The shape was similar, close enough to pass a system check, but it was not mine. I knew my own handwriting. I knew every curve of it after a lifetime of signing forms and checks and documents. This was an imitation, practiced, deliberate. That is not my signature, I said, my voice steady even though my hands were not. He nodded slowly, like he had expected that answer, and then he opened another file, application forms, contact information. And there it was again, the address, Emily's house, the same street, the same number, no mistake, no coincidence, just a direct line between my identity and her front door. I felt something shift inside me then, not panic, not anger, something colder. Something clearer. I asked one more question. The only one that mattered at that point. Who submitted these applications? He hesitated, just for a second, then said, they were submitted online, but the authorized contact listed is Emily Collins. My daughter's name sounded different in that room, like it belonged to someone else, someone I did not recognize. I nodded, because I needed him to see that I understood, even if I did not want to. And then I said, I want copies of everything. Every document, every signature, every record, because in that moment I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I was preparing for what came next, and whatever this was, it was not going to stay hidden any longer. I did not go home right away after leaving the bank. I sat in my car with the engine off, the folder of documents resting on the passenger seat like it weighed more than paper should, because once you see something like that, once you understand that your own child has used your name like it was nothing more than a tool, you cannot just return to your normal routine and pretend you need time, not to calm down, but to remember who you are without all of this. I have spent most of my life being someone for someone else, first as a wife, then as a mother, and when Emily was born, everything else in my life adjusted around her, not the other way around. I remember the small apartment we lived in after her father left. One bedroom, thin walls, a kitchen that barely fit a table, but I made it work. I always made it work. I worked full-time at the library and picked up extra hours whenever I could, shelving books late into the evening, organizing records, helping people find things they had lost, because that is what I have always done. I helped, I fixed, I stayed. I never let things fall apart if I could hold them together. Emily never saw the worst of it. I made sure of that. I packed her lunches. I attended every school event. I stayed up late helping with homework even when my eyes could barely stay open. I remember the day her college acceptance letter arrived, the way she screamed when she opened it, the way she threw her arms around me like all those years had led to that one moment, and I believed it had. I believed that everything I gave up meant something, that it built something solid, something honest, something that would not break when life became complicated. I kept that letter framed for years, hung it where I could see it every morning, a reminder that I had done my job as a mother, that I had raised someone good, someone who understood right from wrong, someone who would never cross certain lines, and that is why sitting in that car felt so unreal. Because the evidence in that folder did not match the person I thought I knew. 18 months of applications, approvals, payments made just enough to keep everything active, calculated, intentional, not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, something planned and carried out over time. And I started to think about all the small things I had ignored, the times Emily asked about my credit, the conversations about interest rates, the casual questions about whether I had ever considered consolidating accounts. I had answered without hesitation, because why would I not? She was my daughter. I trusted her the same way I trusted the ground beneath my feet, without question, without fear, and now I was sitting there realizing that trust had been used, shaped into something else entirely, something I did not recognize. I should have felt angry. I should have been overwhelmed. But what I felt instead was clarity. A quiet kind of understanding that settled in slowly, because this was no longer about what she had done. It was about what I was going to do next. I picked up the folder and opened it again, one page at a time, reading every detail carefully, dates, amounts, signatures, addresses. Every piece of it mattered now. Every piece would be used, because for the first time since that phone call, I was not reacting. I was preparing, and whatever came next. I was not going to face it as her mother. I was going to face it as the owner of my own name, and I was not going to let anyone use it again. When I got home, I did not turn on the television. I did not make dinner. I did not call anyone. I placed the folder on my kitchen table and stood there for a long moment, just looking at it, because that table had seen everything in my life. Every bill I had ever paid, every check I had ever signed, every birthday card, every school form, every decision that kept our lives moving forward, and now it was holding something entirely different, something that did not belong to me but carried my name anyway. I pulled out one of the documents and laid it flat, tracing the signature with my finger, not because I needed to confirm it was not mine, but because I needed to understand how close it was, how carefully someone had tried to make it look real. It was practiced, steady, not rushed. Whoever wrote it had done it more than once, and that realization settled in deeper than anything else. This was not a single mistake. This was repetition, intention, a pattern. I reached for the drawer beside the sink and pulled out my old checkbook, the one I had not used in months but kept anyway out of habit, and I opened it to the last page I had signed, my real signature, the one I had used for decades. The loops were tighter, the pressure heavier in certain strokes, small differences that most people would never notice, but I noticed because it was mine, and seeing the two side by side felt like looking at a copy of my own life that someone else had been writing without my permission. I moved slowly, deliberately, laying out more documents, comparing each one, building a quiet understanding of how far this had gone, loan amounts ranging from $20,000 to $80,000, dates spread across months, payments made just enough to avoid attention. It was careful, almost disciplined, and that made it harder to accept because it meant thought had gone into it, planning, decisions, conversations I had never been part of. I walked over to the wall and took down the framed college letter, the one I had kept all these years. The paper was slightly yellowed now, but the words were still clear, still proud, still full of promise. I held it in my hands for a moment, remembering the day it arrived, the sound of Emily's voice, the way she said, "We did it, Mom," as if everything we had gone through belonged to both of us, and maybe it did, but standing there now, I realized something I had not allowed myself to see before. That moment had been the beginning of her future, not a guarantee of her character. I placed the letter down gently next to the loan documents, two versions of the same story, one built on hope, the other on something else entirely, and I understood then that I could not hold on to both. I could not protect the image I had of her and deal with the reality in front of me at the same time, so I chose the reality, not because it hurt less, but because it was the only thing that would allow me to move forward. I sat down and began organizing everything into a new folder, separating originals from copies, marking dates, making notes. Every detail mattered now. Every piece would have its place, because this was no longer about confusion or disbelief. It was about clarity, about control, about taking back something that had been taken from me without a word. And as I closed the folder, I realized I was not shaking anymore, not because this was easier, but because I had made a decision. I was not going to ask for explanations. I was not going to argue, and I was not going to hope this would fix itself. Whatever came next would be handled the same way I had handled everything else in my life, quietly, carefully, and without hesitation. I did not call Emily that night, and I did not call her the next morning either, because I needed to see something with my own eyes before I said a single word. So I drove to her house that afternoon without telling her I was coming. The same house I had helped her move into 3 years ago, the same driveway where I had stood holding a casserole dish while she laughed and said, "Mom, you do not have to bring food every time," as if I would ever stop taking care of her in the ways I knew how. I parked across the street and sat there for a moment, looking at the front door, the windows, the small details that used to make me feel proud, like I had contributed to something stable in her life. And then I noticed the car in the driveway, a new one, larger than anything I had seen her own before, clean, polished, the kind of car that does not come without a cost. I stepped out and walked up to the door, steady, calm, not rushing, because this was not about confrontation. Not yet. I knocked. once, and when she opened it, her expression shifted just slightly, surprise first, then something else, something I could not quite name but recognized immediately as discomfort. "Mom, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice light, almost casual. But not quite right. I held up the folder just enough for her to see it without opening it, and I said, "We need to talk." She hesitated for a second before stepping aside, letting me in. The house looked different than I remembered. New furniture, new decorations, small upgrades that had appeared quietly over time. Things I had noticed, but never questioned, because I trusted her explanations. I trusted her life to be built on what she told me. Jason was in the living room, sitting on the couch, and when he saw me, he stood up too quickly, like he had not expected this moment either. I sat down at the table without being invited, placed the folder in front of me, and opened it slowly, one page at a time, not speaking until both of them were watching, really watching. "The bank called me yesterday," I said, keeping my voice even, controlled, because I was not there to argue, I was there to listen. Emily crossed her arms, a defensive habit she had carried since she was a teenager. "Mom, if this is about money, we were going to talk to you," she said, and there it was, not denial, not confusion, just a quiet attempt to control the conversation before it began. I looked at her for a long moment, and then I asked, "Did you use my name to apply for these loans?" Silence filled the room, heavy, immediate. Jason shifted his weight. Emily looked at him briefly, and that was all the answer I needed before she spoke. "It is not what you think," she said, and I almost smiled at that. "Because it was exactly what people say when it is precisely what you think." "Then explain it to me," I said, and I leaned back in my chair, giving her the space to speak, because I wanted to hear every word, not just for myself, but for what I would need later. She exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. "We needed help, Mom. The business was not doing well, and we knew your credit was strong. We were going to pay everything back before you ever noticed." I did not interrupt. I did not react. I let her finish, because the more she spoke, the clearer everything became. Jason added quietly, "It was just temporary," as if that word could change the reality of what they had done, as if time could erase intent. I nodded once, slowly, because I understood now, not just what they had done, but how they justified it, and that was more important than anything else. I closed the folder carefully, placed my hands on top of it, and said, "Only one thing, you should have told me," and I stood up, not raising my voice, not asking for more, because there was nothing left to ask. Everything I needed to know was already in that room, and as I walked toward the door, Emily called after me, "Mom, we can fix this," but I did not turn around, because this was not something they could fix, not the way they thought, not anymore. I did not drive far after leaving Emily's house. I pulled over at a small parking lot near a grocery store and turned off the engine, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed to make a decision before anything else could happen. Because once you choose a direction in a situation like this, you cannot step back and pretend it never started, and I understood something very clearly sitting there. This was no longer a family conversation. It had already crossed into something else. Something defined by documents, signatures, and consequences, not emotions, not explanations, not promises to fix things later. I took the folder from the passenger seat and placed it in my lap, opening it again even though I already knew what was inside, because I wanted to look at it one more time with a different mindset, not as a mother trying to understand her daughter, but as someone whose name had been used without permission, whose identity had been treated like a resource instead of a boundary. I read through the loan summaries, the payment histories, the approval dates, and I noticed something I had not allowed myself to fully process before: the timing. Each application spaced out carefully, each approval followed by just enough payment to keep everything active. It was not careless, it was controlled, and that meant they had expected this to continue. They had expected me to never question it, to never notice, to remain exactly where I had always been, trusting, available, silent. I closed the folder slowly and reached for my phone, not to call Emily, not to argue, not to ask for anything. I searched for a number I had not used in years, a name I remembered from a time when life required a different kind of strength. David Morrison, estate attorney, the same man who helped me settle everything after Emily's father left. The same man who once told me, Mrs. Collins, your name is one of the most valuable things you own. Protect it. I had not thought about that sentence in years. But now it felt like the only thing that mattered. The phone rang twice before he answered, his voice older but still steady. David Morrison speaking. I took a breath and said, "This is Margaret Collins. I need to speak with you about a matter involving fraud and identity misuse." There was a pause on the other end. Not hesitation, just attention sharpening. "Are you safe to talk?" he asked, and I realized what he meant. Not physical safety, but clarity, privacy, readiness. "Yes," I said, because I was. More than I had been in a long time. We scheduled a meeting for the next morning, 9 o'clock, his office downtown, and after I hung up, I sat there for another minute, not thinking about Emily, not thinking about what she had said or how she looked. When I walked out, I was thinking about what came next, about documentation, about process, about steps that would not depend on anyone else's honesty or intentions. I started the car and drove home, and when I walked inside, I did not feel the same weight I had felt the night before, not because anything had been resolved, but because I had chosen a path. I placed the folder on the table again, this time in a different position, aligned, deliberate, like it belonged to a system now. Not just a moment. I wrote down a list of everything I needed to bring to the meeting, every document, every date, every detail that could not be left out, and when I finished, I looked at the list and understood something with complete certainty. I was not going to argue my way out of this. I was not going to ask for fairness. I was going to document the truth and let the law define what came next, and for the first time since the phone call, I felt something steady return, not comfort, not relief, but control, and I knew I was not going to let that go. David's office had not changed in over a decade. The same dark wood desk, the same shelves lined with thick legal books, the same quiet atmosphere that made every word feel heavier than it sounded. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the waiting area with the folder in my hands, not flipping through it this time, just holding it. Because I already knew what it contained and what it meant. When his assistant opened the door and called my name, I stood up without hesitation and walked in. David looked up from his desk and nodded once. Professional, focused. "Mrs. Collins," he said, gesturing for me to sit, and I placed the folder in front of him without any introduction, without any explanation beyond what was necessary. "My name was used to open multiple loan accounts without my authorization," I said. And that was all it took for his expression to shift from polite to precise. He opened the folder and began reviewing the documents one by one, slowly, carefully, not skipping anything. The room stayed quiet except for the sound of paper moving and the occasional note he made in the margin. I watched him work, not because I needed reassurance, but because I needed to see how this looked through someone else's eyes, someone who understood the law the way I understood routine. After several minutes, he closed the folder and looked at me directly. "Did you sign any of these documents?" he asked. "No," I said, and there was no hesitation in my voice, no uncertainty left. "Did you give anyone permission to use your identity for financial applications?" he continued. "No," I answered again, and that second answer seemed to settle something in his mind. He leaned back slightly and folded his hands. "Then what you are describing is identity fraud and financial misrepresentation, potentially multiple counts depending on how these applications were processed." He said it calmly, without emphasis, but the words carried weight, not emotional weight, factual weight, the kind that does not change once it is spoken. I nodded once, because I already knew this was where it was going. I just needed it confirmed. "The authorized contact listed as my daughter," I added, not as an accusation, just as information. David did not react the way most people would. There was no surprise, no judgment, just a slight pause as he considered the implication. "That complicates the situation emotionally, but not legally," he said, and that sentence stayed with me because it separated something I had been trying to hold together, emotion and law. Two things that do not operate on the same rules. He turned the folder back toward me and tapped one of the pages. These signatures are inconsistent with standard verification patterns, and the use of your credit profile without consent is significant. We can proceed in several ways, but the first step is documentation and formal reporting. I listened without interrupting, because this was the part that mattered. Not what I felt, not what Emily intended, but what could be proven, what could be established, what could be acted on. He outlined the process clearly: filing a fraud report with the financial institutions, notifying credit bureaus, initiating a formal investigation, and, if necessary, escalating to legal action that would involve law enforcement. Each step was structured, defined, not driven by reaction but by procedure. I asked only one question: if I do this, there is no way to keep it private, is there? He met my gaze without hesitation. No, once the process begins, it becomes a matter of record. I nodded, because that was the confirmation I needed, not of the process, but of the consequence. I closed the folder and placed my hands on top of it again, the same way I had the day before. But this time it felt different. Not uncertain, not heavy, just final. Then we begin, I said, and as those words left my mouth, I understood that whatever happened next would not be undone by apologies, explanations, or promises. It would be defined by evidence, by records, by the law itself. And for the first time since I walked into that bank, I was not waiting for something to happen. I was making it happen. The process did not take weeks to begin. It started that same afternoon, because once something is documented, it moves faster than emotions ever could. David filed the initial fraud report with the bank before I even left his office, attaching copies of every document, every signature, every discrepancy we had identified, and by the time I arrived home, there was already a confirmation email waiting for me, formal language, case number assigned, investigation pending. It felt different seeing it written that way, not as something personal, but as something official, structured, something that no longer belonged to a conversation between me and my daughter, but to a system that would follow its own rules regardless of what any of us wanted. I did not call Emily, and she did not call me that day either. But the next morning my phone rang before 9, her name on the screen, and I let it ring twice before answering, not to make a point, but because I needed to hear her voice without reacting to it. "Mom, what did you do?" she asked immediately. No greeting, no hesitation, just urgency. I leaned back in my chair and said, "I reported what happened." And there was a pause on the other end, longer this time, heavier. "You did not have to do that," she said, her voice lower now, controlled, like she was trying to bring the situation back into something she could manage. "We told you we were going to fix it." I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt. I let her finish, because I had already heard this version of the story. And it no longer changed anything. "This is not about fixing it," I said. "This is about what was done." Another pause, and then Jason's voice in the background, asking what was happening, and I could hear the shift in tone as she tried to explain, not to me, but to him. Words like report, bank, investigation, moving quickly between them, and I realized something in that moment. They had never expected this. Not really. They had expected a conversation, maybe an argument, maybe even anger, but not this. Not documentation, not a process they could not control. Emily came back on the line, her voice tighter now. "Do you understand what this means?" she asked, and I answered honestly, yes, because I did. I understood exactly what it meant, not just for them, but for me, for the version of our relationship that no longer existed. "You are going to ruin everything," she said, and that sentence stayed with me, not because it hurt, but because it revealed something I had not fully seen before. In her mind, the damage was not what had already been done. It was what I was doing now by addressing it. I looked at the folder on my table, the same one that had started all of this, and I said, "That already happened." Quietly, without emphasis, because it was not an argument, it was a fact. She did not respond right away, and when she did, her voice had changed again, softer, uncertain. "Mom, please, we can work this out. Just stop the process." I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not because I was reconsidering, but because I was remembering the years I had spent believing that my role was to absorb problems, to protect her from consequences, to make things easier when they became difficult. And I understood then that if I stopped now, nothing would change. Not really, it would only continue in a different form. I opened my eyes and said, I am not stopping anything, and this time there was no hesitation, no softness, just clarity. The line went quiet, and after a few seconds, she hung up, not angrily, not dramatically, just disconnected, and I placed the phone back on the table beside the folder, because that was where everything was now, not in words, not in explanations, but in records, in reports, in a process that had already begun, and whatever happened next would not be decided in a conversation, it would be revealed in the outcome. The investigation did not end in a single moment. It unfolded over the next several weeks in quiet updates, formal letters, and phone calls that carried more weight than any conversation ever could. The bank confirmed what David had already suspected. The signatures did not match verified records, the application patterns showed consistent misuse, and the accounts were flagged as fraudulent under my name. One by one the loans were frozen, then reversed, the responsibility shifting away from me. And, toward the individuals who had submitted them, I received copies of every report, every finding, every conclusion, and each document felt less like a resolution and more like a confirmation of something I had already accepted. This had happened. And it had happened intentionally. Emily called twice during that time, both times leaving messages, her voice careful, measured, asking if we could talk, if we could find another way to handle things, but I did not return those calls, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to discuss that would change the process already in motion. This was no longer a matter of explanation, it was a matter of record, and records do not respond to emotion, they respond to facts. I met with David again when the final documentation was complete. He reviewed everything with the same steady focus as before. The financial liability has been removed from your name, he said. Your credit has been restored, and the accounts have been reassigned as part of the fraud investigation. I nodded. Because that was what I had asked for, not revenge, not punishment, just the restoration of what belonged to me. He paused for a moment before adding, there may be further legal consequences depending on how the case proceeds, and I understood what he meant, but I did not ask for details, because that part no longer belonged to me. I had done what I needed to do, I had protected my name, and what followed was no longer within my control or my responsibility. When I returned home that evening, the house felt the same as it always had, quiet, familiar, unchanged, but I felt different moving through it, not lighter, not relieved, just certain. I walked to the wall where the college letter had once hung and looked at the empty space. I had not put it back, not because I wanted to forget that moment, but because I understood it differently now. It was a memory, not a measure of who someone would become. I sat at the kitchen table and placed the final report in front of me, reading the closing statement one more time. Everything aligned, everything accounted for, everything resolved in the way that mattered most, and I realized something then. I had not lost anything in this process, not my name, not my stability, not even my sense of self. What I had lost was the belief that love meant allowing someone to cross every boundary without consequence, and that was not something I wanted back. I folded the report carefully and placed it in a drawer, not hidden, just stored, where it belonged, as a record of what had happened and how it had been handled. And as I closed the drawer, I understood that this was not the end of a story about money or law. It was the end of a pattern I had lived with for far too long, a pattern of giving without limits, trusting without question, and accepting things that should never have been accepted, and for the first time in a long time, I was not waiting for someone else to define. What came next, I already had, quietly, clearly, and without asking for permission.